just a quick intro here. Let me share my screen. And we can, so thanks everybody for joining us. Really glad to be starting off the third seminar in our monthly. I think people are still getting kicked back into the waiting room and bouncing back in. So hopefully we didn't lose anybody. Welcome to the third seminar in our 2022 STIR seminar series. And thanks to our institutional partners at ASU, East, and Maastricht. And thanks also to our co-organizers who are dispersed throughout the world and help advertise the seminar. And we have 3 of them here. So thanks very much for your participation and support. Just to remind us all, the mission here is to provide opportunities for the STIR community to learn from one another, to connect, and to grow and extend. Also, for those who need a refresher, there are basically 3 main methodological components to STIR: the decision protocol, the embedded humanist, or more broadly, a certain ethos of engagement, and the analytical framework for midstream modulation. And together, these help us collaboratively describe normal expert decision situations in real time. Why do we do that? Well, primarily to understand the nature and limitations of expert capacities to participate in broader frameworks and systems and aspirations for the normative governance of research and innovation in society, but also to explore the scope for expansion of these decision capacities, and also to actually expand and deepen these capacities. However, we're very careful when we move into this sort of third mode of expanding and deepening, because we don't want to depart from the rigorous systems that we have put in place to understand and explore. And partly that is because we want to sort of refrain from imposing our agendas, which of course is a very difficult thing to do, but nevertheless we make an effort to do so. And that ends up not only making STIR more potent as a research approach, but ironically and paradoxically, it also seems to heighten its ability to actually impact the situations that we study. So as many of you know, the STIR community has been very active over the last decade or so. There have been 80 known STIR studies, and these studies tend to be 12 weeks long. And they've taken place on 4 different continents, and a number of publications and works in progress have documented these studies. Every month during this seminar series, we feature one of these publications. And this month, I'm very pleased to be welcoming Dr. Shannon Conley as our speaker. And Shannon is an associate professor at James Madison University, where she's also the co-director of the JMU STS Futures Lab. Shannon is also the PI and co-PI on a number of National Science Foundation grants, several of which feature the STIR approach. And Shannon has been involved with STIR since the very beginning. She was one of the first doctoral students to sort of be recruited into the original STIR project. And she's done pioneering work in conducting some of the early STIR studies and helping to refine and clarify the method. And she's also done theoretical work in terms of conceptualizing how STIR fits into broader sociological frameworks. And I think it's fair to say that she is one of, if not the leading world expert when it comes to bringing STIR into a pedagogical environment, since she has done so much work bringing STIR into primarily STEM environments, STEM pedagogical environments. And so we'll probably touch on this in the latter part of her presentation. But without further ado, let me just, thank Shannon for being here and welcome her, and just remind everyone that, this paper of hers was sent out in advance. So if you did get a chance to read it, feel free to ask questions about it. And other than that, I will hand the the screen over to Shannon, and thank you, Shannon, and
the screen baton, if you will. So thank you so much, Eric. Let me find my window that I need to share. Okay, can folks see that? Okay, wonderful. So I really loved how Eric introduced, in his introduction, talked about expertise. And one of the things I'm really interested in is not only engaging with experts and learning more about experts, such as the experts we engage with in the STIR process, but also what sorts of things and kind of competence can folks like STIR fellows pick up along the way, both in terms of better understanding linguistically, being able to engage in deep, detailed conversations with one's collaborators, and also I'm also very interested in the role that engagement in the hands-on material practices plays in kind of growing this competency and understanding and an ability to engage with folks who are from other fields. So that's basically ever since I started stirring about, I've been really interested in it, and it was wonderful to learn that there are folks who are interested in studying this sort of thing. So the title of my talk is Two Tales of Stirring, an Embedded Humanist in Genetics Laboratories. So putting this talk together was just really a lot of fun, because it brought back a lot of memories, and has been helping me see connections to what I'm doing today and where I'm at today. And if we have enough time, we'll be able to talk more about kind of what I'm doing now. So this is me then, as a young Sterling, if you will, in a British Columbia lab, basically preparing to run a PCR gel. And here I am a couple of months ago in a laboratory doing a very similar thing. And I'll kind of share the story of how all that came to be, if hopefully we'll have time. But one thing I definitely want to mention is it's pretty cool that basically this seminar and one of my biotechnology students' presentations at it's a conference in Toronto focused on science, technology, and medicine. Basically, we're next to each other. So she was presenting on her capstone project, in which she's essentially her interest is to bring material practices and ethical reasoning together within a genetics class, because in her experience, going all the way back to C.P. Snow, the ethics component has been, kind of separated out and isolated and just kind of checkbox for, particular science programs. And so she was very passionate about bringing these things together, and the conceptual buttressing really comes from STIR. And she's also using the STIR protocol as a pre-test and a post-test for her project. So she's doing a classroom intervention. And I can talk more about this later, but it was just really exciting to, see a young person, a new generation of STIRs presenting on their work. And these are the people who I think are really going to be the engagement agents of the future as we, continue disseminating this method and approach. But without further ado, we're going to take a blast to the past and go over some of my 2009 case studies in which I was embedded in genetics labs in Canada and the UK. And so basically the overview is I'm going to basically kind of separate out these case studies as much as I can. So the Canadian experience and then the experience in the UK, and some of the special and unique things that emerged from both of those experiences, and also highlight some of the similarities. So I'll be talking a little bit about the two cultures, or the perceived two cultures, initial hesitancies, resistance, distrust initially, as me as a new person, a social scientist, was suddenly hanging out in a lab where people didn't really know me, and they were hesitant at first. So one of the things we were discussing earlier was what is the role of ignorance and kind of how I think about the STIR project. And so I'll be talking about the initial ignorance I had in terms of the linguistic aspects of what was happening in the laboratory. It felt like we were speaking two different languages, which is a theme that'll kind of pop up in just a couple of minutes. I'll also talk about, what does it mean to gain trust, and also interactional competence. So the ability to have a rich discussion with someone from a different discipline around a topic in that other expert's area. I'll also talk about engaging in and transferring material practices, and then if there's time, we can talk about where I am now. So this was my first field site, and I should mention all these pictures were taken with permission, and all names have been changed, in accordance with the IRB. So yes, so all of this has been done with, all these images are taken with permission. So the first field site was based in British Columbia. It's a reproductive genetics laboratory where the folks focused on novel prenatal diagnosis techniques, genetic causes of premature infertility, and a focus on chromosomal abnormalities, the role of epigenetics, particularly in the placenta. So this particular laboratory was in close contact and in close collaboration with an adjacent hospital, in which they would, folks would volunteer, after giving birth, to provide their placenta for analysis. So there were often many jokes made in this lab about placentas, and they even made a placenta birthday cake. So so that's the British Columbia site in a nutshell, and I'll get more into the various folks and characters who are involved in just a minute. So the second field site was in the United Kingdom, also focusing on reproductive genetics, a little bit of a different focus. The PI really focused on craniofacial malformation, and like the other lab, there was a very close connection between the laboratory and the adjoining hospital. So the PI would spend quite a lot of time in the clinic with patients. There was research around autism genetics, connection between paternal age and tumors, also animal work as well, on mice and zebrafish, in which, you know, various changes would, they would attempt to induce various changes and then, you know, analyze them afterwards. And I should know that, note that this lab in the last couple of years made headlines, and I'm going to try to be vague and ambiguous, so, you know, to protect privacy, but you know, there's been a lot of talk about maternal age and, you know, issues with birth and conceiving and all that sort of thing. But this lab was part of a project that actually looked at the role of paternal age and its role in conception and, you know, issues down the road. So hopefully that was sufficiently ambiguous, but interesting to whet your appetite. So I kind of have to bring up the well-known, perhaps well-known by some of you, maybe not all of you, but C.P. Snow's writings and thoughts on the two cultures, the divide between the humanities and the natural sciences. And although, you know, this might seem like a bit of an archaic and not particularly descriptive or not completely descriptive of the complex and dynamic relationship between the human and natural sciences, this perspective fits surprisingly well in the first stages of both of my laboratory engagements. So Snow, reflecting on his initial experiences, remarks that he was moving among two groups who had almost ceased to communicate at all, had so little in common that instead of going from Burlington House or South Kensington to Chelsea, one might have crossed an ocean. So my initial conversations with senior scientists, as well as PhD students in the two different laboratories, indicated certain cultural understanding of the relationship between the social and natural sciences, that, you know, there's two different cultures and they don't come together unless there's a specific issue that needs to be addressed. And the relationship, if there is to be one, is really one of utility. So on the next couple of slides are a few selected interview quotes illustrating my collaborators' initial thoughts regarding the relationship between the social and natural sciences, as well as you know, my presence there as a social scientist. But you'll certainly see the theme of this idea of talking two different languages kind of resonate throughout. So yeah, and when I first met with the PI in the Canadian lab, one of the first things she said was, "It's like we're talking two different languages. I really feel like, you know, I don't understand what you're doing in the social sciences. I don't fully understand what you're trying to do with this project, but, you know, we'll see how it goes. Happy you're here." But, you know, she really emphasized, you know, kind of this linguistic difference. So moving on. This is another quote from the PI in the Canadian lab, where she says she dabbled in social sciences for a particular project, but she wouldn't do it again. So she says, ultimately, social science is soft science. It's good because you can point to it as evidence. It was fun, but not something I would want to do again. And so that gave me a lot to chew on. So this is a comment from a high-ranking postdoc in the UK lab. So she says, I have no idea what you could bring in. I'm sure there's something, I just can't see it. Would it only be during a situation of crisis? Would it be before the crisis occurred? I do strongly believe that there's a lot to do with interdisciplinary study, but that requires knowledge and interest. And it's very difficult to do that because, here again, people don't speak the same language. And then finally, in a conversation with one of the advanced PhD students in the Canadian lab, as I was making these initial connections and just kind of getting to know folks, he noted that he doesn't make decisions. And when I brought up the topic of politics, he said, nothing I do is political. I just do what the PI asks. And of course, now I kind of see myself as a bit of a Socratic gadfly. And so I kind of pushed and pushed and pushed and perturbed him. And he was one of my interlocutors, and we would do the STIR protocol every week. And so eventually he came to this conclusion that, yeah, actually I do make decisions, and there is this broader ecosystem that my work is related to. Again, in all of these perspectives, the social scientist, the humanities scholar is viewed as having one set of expertise, and the natural scientist has another. And moving on, the two only come together for the perception is that the two only come together for short bouts of time to address specific issues related to specific events. In this model, the social scientist intervention or collaboration occurs in the downstream of scientific research. After research agendas have already been set, experiments are undertaken and articles are authored. The laboratory, the locus in the midstream of research and development activity, has traditionally not been viewed as a place for governance of research. Typically, the assumption would be that such activity would either occur upstream, where those mandates are set, or downstream, when the research results make it into the public sphere. And by this time, it's often too late to augment research and technological trajectories. However, engagement within the laboratory context itself, the midstream, enables proactive engagement with issues before the crises that were alluded to in one of those quotes up here. So an additional complexity that I encountered initially was the hesitation and distrust that many of the laboratory members had regarding my presence in their space. While each laboratory had its own unique dynamic, there were certainly a number of different similarities in terms of how my role was initially perceived by the researchers. Members of both laboratories asked me if I was spending time in the laboratory in order to dig up, quote unquote, dig up dirt on them. There were also fears that I would give away privileged laboratory information, either accidentally or intentionally, therefore jeopardizing their ability to publish. The Canadian laboratory members asked me if I was secretly an embedded journalist, intent on digging up the wrongdoing in their daily activities. So while the journalist framing was predominant in Vancouver, there was one particular laboratory member in the UK who I'll call Sean, who asked me if the purpose of my study was to, quote unquote, psychoanalyze the laboratory members. And, over and over again, I I tried to connect with him. I tried to say I was interested in decision making and their perspectives on decision making, but he was one of the holdouts. So his unease would pretty saliently manifest when one of the laboratory members and I would go to have our interview, have our weekly conversation, and he would literally shout in the laboratory, "Have fun getting psychoanalyzed." So that was a common comment that he would call out that I just kind of learned to ignore. But in general, the initial distrust exhibited by many of the laboratory members slowly subsided over the first few weeks as we began building our trust relationship. So during the first 2 weeks of the Canadian laboratory engagement, I despaired ever coming to a real understanding of what the researchers did in their daily practices. And my goal was to understand decision-making in their daily practices. And I would just stare mystified at these large machines that surrounded my workspace, which they kindly did give me a workspace in the lab. So I had my own little space. And I would overhear conversations regarding SNPs. And I was like, what the heck is a SNP? I desperately scanned the internet. I Googled SNIP. Nothing came up. So I was not able to find a clue to this mysterious SNP entity that seemed to be so popular in laboratory conversations. So this is where the ignorance as a tool comes in. I decided that despite the potential embarrassment it might cause me, and I knew I would be a little embarrassed, that I would broach this topic in my interviews with the researchers. So I had weekly interviews with collaborators Joy and Z, 2 PhD students, and they served as my primary source of information, particularly when it came to understanding and learning the language of genetics. And the primary reason that I could not solve this mystery of the SNP is that although the term is pronounced SNP as an SNIP, it's actually an acronym, SNP, which stands for single nucleotide polymorphism. These polymorphisms, or SNPs, occur when one letter of the genetic code gets switched out for another letter. And depending where these SNPs occur, they can either be harmless or are considered a genetic mutation and can have vast impact on human development and health. So just again, it was really exciting when it felt like my first foray into a foreign language when I began engaging with them, and being okay with being uncomfortable and being in that uncomfortable space in which I had to have intellectual humility and ask, and they were actually really excited to engage with me and share. Although conducting interviews and spending time in the lab was important for establishing rapport and trust relationships, time in and of itself does not necessarily equate to gaining competence or understanding. So at this point, although I was kind of beginning to breach the kind of linguistics, connecting these conversations to material practices was still a mystery to me. So yeah, at this point I could engage in conversation about scientific practices and could even string the words polymerase chain reaction together, but I really couldn't connect the concept with the practice. So again, I could engage in conversation about practices, but still didn't understand them, because I felt like even though I was embedded in the laboratory, I was present, I had my own space, and I was surrounded by this equipment, I felt disassociated from it. The researchers would explain these ideas multiple times, yet there was still, I'm not quite sure what the right word is, but like a cognitive dissonance between the discourse and the practice. So there was an opportunity for me to move from engaging with linguistic concepts to engaging with techniques, material techniques. And this came in my interactions with Frank, who is a postdoctoral researcher in the Canadian laboratory. We became benchside friends. Our work benches were next to each other, and we would just kind of chit chat about the various things he was doing, the day-to-day activities, and although we would have, our formal kind of decision-making protocol conversations, we were still able to really engage in rich discussions about his decisions, because we were just in close proximity, and he was open to talking. So it was about 3 weeks into the project, and I asked Frank if I could watch him do a PCR, and that's what folks in the lab would say. It was part of their vernacular that they were going to go, quote unquote, do a PCR. And so that same day he agreed, and he transformed into a key informant. He was excited. He readily agreed to me watching him do the PCR, but he did a lot more than that. He pulled up PowerPoint slides. He began teaching me about genetics. He realized that we'd kind of have to start at the basics when I didn't really know what a PCR was. So rather than pretend to know something that I didn't, I admitted that I hardly understood it, with only a vague understanding from popular television shows such as CSI. So he described to me how all genetics research depends on DNA amplification, and this is where PCR comes in. And PCR stands for polymerase chain reaction. It's both a process and an entity, which kind of explains some of my earlier confusion, because it's both a process and an entity, and it's used in linguistically in different ways in the lab. It's an action, I'm going to do it. It's also the actual material object itself. So that definitely kind of clarified things for me quite a bit. So this process includes putting together a complex combination of liquids to create amplification of DNA. So when a researcher says that he or she has to go do a, quote unquote, do a PCR, the expression encompasses both the process of mixing liquids and the machine itself. And to do it well, it requires both experience and skill. So by this point, about 4 weeks in, I was interacting with the researchers on a daily basis in casual social situations. So we'd have coffee breaks, lab outings to lunch, and the researchers would provide me with updates on their projects. Frank and I would discuss when he would start and end his experiments, confirming timetables so I could be there when he was analyzing data. And when I arrived at the lab each day, he'd provide me with an update of the ongoing saga of successful PCRs, failed PCRs, and the latest sequencing challenges and successes. So at this point, I was not only interviewing researchers about their work, I was no longer being perceived as an embedded journalist or, someone, bent on digging up dirt. I was becoming an invested participant. It felt like I was almost part of a family. And fast forwarding about 9 weeks into this project, we continued engaging in both social events and conversations around their scientific activities. Frank showed me that he had redesigned the laboratory members' pictures and biographies on the door to include my own picture and blurb. And that certainly meant a lot in terms of gaining trust and feeling like a member of a team as opposed to kind of an outside, just kind of coolly observing entity. So in those outings, in those kind of casual engagements, I mentioned to some of the researchers that it was actually on Facebook that I posted it. I posted that I was interested in auditing a genetics class, just so I could become more well-versed in their field. And one of them saw it, and we began having a conversation. And I was confronted by Z, one of the PhD students, who had learned that I was, interested in learning more. Why would you want to do that? He demanded. And after I explained my motives, Frank, the postdoc, who was also present, asked if I had done a PCR. And when I responded that I had not, they immediately suggested that I try my hand at one. So I think that they were genuinely excited that I was willing to get out of my comfort zone and do the same things that they did on a daily basis. And here's just some of the benefits that I perceived as kind of emerging from that: greater legitimacy, respect, a sense of being part of a team, and continued new and developing interactional competence, being able to kind of dig deeper as we had conversations. And I felt like I was understanding things on a much deeper level. So here I am doing PCR. So within a matter of days of this conversation, I was donning a white lab coat, these blue gloves that you can see, and I was armed with a pipette. And I was doing my own PCR. I was so excited. And Eric was actually here for this experience. So I was no longer just at the bench side having these conversations, but I was at the bench itself. The researchers found it novel, humorous, exciting, that I was rolling up my sleeves and engaging in the physical and material aspects of their work. When the technician saw me working, she exclaimed, "Wow, I can't believe my eyes." They were so shocked to see me in a lab coat and pipetting away. And so it was quite the novelty for them. So they excitedly snapped various pictures of me holding samples, holding pipettes, and this one, of course. But it was truly a vital learning experience. It provided me with insight into their scientific practice that I don't think I would have had otherwise. My hands were quite shaky, I have to admit, as I was pipetting, but I managed to successfully pipette the product into the wells. And a few hours later, after the completed gel electrophoresis part of the PCR, Frank, the postdoc, found the results to be, and I was shocked at this, but he found them to be so exemplary that he ran to the copy machine and made a copy and said that he wanted to use this image in his future lectures on the topic when it came to PCRs. These lectures would include guest lectures and also genetics courses that he would teach in Canada and his home country. And in particular, that particular day, it was testing for the presence of the sex determining region on the Y chromosome. So my evolving multi-level participation in the British Columbia laboratory culminated in one of the final laboratory meetings. After about 3 months of engaging with the researchers inside of the laboratory, outside of the laboratory, socially, and finally materially, I was invited to give a lab talk. And they asked me to talk about responsible innovation. So following the spirit and philosophy behind the STIR project, I just, after kind of reviewing, you know, kind of the latest and greatest in terms of RI literature, I opened it up and asked the laboratory members themselves how they would define responsible innovation. And so the rest of the time was dedicated to dialogue. I was really interested in what their thoughts were on the subject, especially in the context of their own lab. And so I touched on one of my initial conversations with Joy, who was a PhD student, in which she had discussed the lack of patient engagement in the lab when compared to what the laboratory down the hall, which would bring patients together for a yearly workshop and update these patients on the state of the laboratory's Huntington's research progress. Joy was actually out of town at the time, and so I relayed Joy's idea to the rest of the lab members and the PI. I said, "Can this lab do something like the other lab is doing?" I inquired. The PI said that she wasn't sure what other labs were doing in terms of patient research, but mentioned that she had wanted to put out a newsletter to the lab's patients for quite a while. She claimed the major setback was that she wanted to design it herself and didn't have the time to get the newsletter underway. This prompted her to jump out of her chair and run to her office to grab a newsletter that had been sent to her house. And she provided the example to show how an engagement newsletter should look. And so I thought I had seen the last of this newsletter idea until the very last lab meeting that I attended, where the PI casually mentioned to her students and the researchers that she wanted them to write lay summaries of their research for this iterative patient newsletter. She noted that it would be great for people to be involved in the process and know the progress of it. So following that last meeting, the laboratory members commented to me that the responsible innovation dialogue was likely the driving factor behind Alice, the PI's new motivation to make a patient newsletter a reality. So, and this was a comment from the PhD student who is unfortunately unable to participate in the responsible innovation conversation, but this was what I introduced to the lab as part of my contribution to the discussion on responsible innovation, of course, crediting her. So in my final interview with this particular PhD student, Joy, we were discussing the various activities that her lab was doing in terms of actively integrating social and ethical considerations into their work. And I brought up the newsletter as a way that the lab was actively pursuing this, pursuing integration. And she asked, was that your idea? And I was like, no, it was yours. I just related. So Eric actually encountered a similar experience where a change in material practices was not triggered by an external mandate or policy, but rather by the participants' own latent concerns. He notes that, quote, the engagement may have influenced practice, but to do so, it required the practitioner's desire to remedy a perceived deficiency. So at a specific point along the way in each of my studies, there was this shift from conversing with the researchers about their experiments to actively participating in their material practices alongside them. So Harry Collins saliently highlights this transition from the painful period of ignorance to finally being able to join in and even transfer knowledge amongst scientists to the point where the embedded humanists, the social scientists can coherently engage with one's expert scientists collaborators. So the opportunity to engage in material practices in the laboratory in the United Kingdom came very early on. Actually, the first day of the engagement, actually not even the first day, it was the evening before my study was supposed to begin. I accompanied one of the postdocs on a brief evening trip to the lab to put some samples into the freezer, and I commented to him how familiar the laboratory seemed. Despite Canada and the UK being separated by an ocean. I gestured to the various instruments, such as the pipettes, stating how I had used them to prepare PCR product and do experiments in the Vancouver lab. And his eyes lit up when I mentioned that I had that experience. And he noted that he had hundreds of samples and PCRs to do. So it would be great to have my assistance and another pair of hands. So 2 weeks in, I was again wearing a lab coat, assisting John with the preparation of gels, pipetting that product into hundreds of little wells. I'd regularly assist him with his experiments, typically spending 2 or 3 days of the week, either at the lab bench working alongside him or accompanying him to the what they called the mouse house, checking in on the genetically modified mice that he used for his work. He expresses admiration of the work that I had been doing, and even called me a quote unquote PCR god, stating that pipetting 100 wells and making a gel is a good day's work for anyone. So unless they already knew of me as the PI was his pseudonym is Edward Jones. So unless they already knew of me as the Jones Laboratories American social scientist, other researchers at the research facility assumed I was also a geneticist based on my growing capacity to fluently converse with them, empathize with their day-to-day challenges. If their PCR was not turning out, or they were feeling overwhelmed by the amount of pipetting that they had to do, I could understand and even oddly offer advice in some circumstances. And I was in particular able to empathize with the struggles of one of the doctoral students in the lab, Sonny, and help him think through his work on, he kept having failed PCRs, and I was able to actually transfer an artifact from the British Columbia lab to the United Kingdom lab, which happened to be essentially, Frank had designed a PCR sheet where one could record every minute detail of every step of the process, what was going into the solution, the times, etc. And that's what I had used during my time in the Canadian laboratory. But before I met Sunny, I learned about his PCR challenges in my first conversation with the PI, who had mentioned his pseudonym Edward Jones. And part of our conversation centered around trying to understand each other's quote unquote cultures. He expressed to me that he only understood about quote unquote 1/10 of what I do. And I also mentioned that I was still trying to understand what he did too. But I explained that I had been engaging in some material practices in the Canadian lab and had some basic understanding of genetics from a practitioner's perspective, but there was still a lot to learn. And I showed him the PCR results that I had completed in the Canadian lab. And he stated, "You're probably equal to or farther along in your understanding of genetics as Sunny is, who has been here for months and still can't manage to do a PCR." So I had great empathy for Sunny. But his comment that I was equally competent or surpassing in understanding material practices as one of his doctoral students, I was really not anticipating this acknowledgement of my increasing capacities for material competence and understanding. That day following my conversation with the PI, Sunny and I were casually chatting in the lab, and he showed me his PCR notebook. Most of the researchers in this particular lab use red notebooks in which they would record their experiments and notes, but they didn't have a particular format like the PCR sheet that Frank used. And he showed me images of his PCRs in which there was always a lack of bands, and ultimately they always ended in failure. He couldn't go any farther in his research until he could master this process. So I shared the I shared the PCR sheet with him, and also mentioned maybe we could compare PCRs, and pulled out the PCR that I had shown the lab director just the day before, and he demanded, "Where did you get this?" And I said, "It's from my laboratory engagement this past summer. This is one of the PCRs that I did." And he was shocked that I did it. He was like, "You did this? The bands look so nice. Bloody good. Goes to show that you don't need a scientific background to do a PCR." So I ultimately contacted Frank from the Canadian lab and asked him if Shannon could have a digital copy of the PCR sheet design. Frank was happy to oblige and was excited that someone was interested in using his sheet. So going back to John, who I spent the majority of my time with, pipetting and working on PCRs with, his particular work focused on autism genetics. And during a bench-side conversation with him, I mentioned that I was in the process of learning about pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, which more broadly, I'm interested in the governance of reproductive technologies and genetic technologies. And so through the process of learning at that more kind of macro level, I learned what pre-implantation genetic diagnosis is. And it's a technique that enables genetic analysis of in vitro embryos before they are implanted into the womb. You might be somewhat familiar with the concept from the film Gattaca if you've seen that in a science fiction context. but it's been lauded by supporters as a miracle technique because it can enable couples who have, they might be carriers for devastating genetic diseases, conditions, to have healthy babies, because each embryo, a cell is biopsied from it, and its genetics are analyzed. It's also been criticized as a bringer of a new eugenics, of scientists playing God, as other genetic predispositions unrelated to disease, such as sex, eye color, height, and other characteristics could be tested for. And now with the advent of gene editing, you know, there's just more to add to that conversation. And the practice has been critiqued by some religious groups as well, because any unused embryos or embryos with undesired genetic predispositions are discarded. So I asked him for his thoughts on Pgd and autism. I said, what if your research on autism genetics was applied to the diagnosis of embryos? If your project is successful and the research is published, you know, if you're able to find particular genetic markers, you know, although autism is a very genetically complex condition, if you're able to publish on that, there exists the potential that these markers that you identify could be used to screen embryos for this condition. Are you comfortable with the results of your research being used in such a way? And I just kind of this was just kind of a casual conversation. I was not saying it in kind of any hostile way. It was not like waving an ethics flag or anything like that. I was just curious if you know, what he thought about it. And he said, I have honestly never thought about this issue before. He said he would hope that the research results would focus on helping people. He noted autism isn't a death sentence. People with autism can live fulfilling lives and can benefit greatly from therapeutic measures. And his hope was that his research could serve as a diagnostic tool, but certainly the idea of it being used as a eugenic tool or a tool for eliminating embryos that you know, could potentially be carrying these particular genetics really horrified him. So he had never really thought about it before, and it was a nice opportunity to have a really meaningful conversation. And this was towards the end of the engagement in the United Kingdom. So I see integration work as being able to foster interactional competence, stirs very hands-on, stir sensibilities, allude to the interactive nature of integration activities. And the different experiences that I've described, I think really engage with this vision. And they also exemplify how integration activities can be literally and meaningfully hands-on with social scientists, not only dialoguing with natural scientists while the scientists are working at their bench, but actually working alongside the scientists at the bench with the scientists. And this scenario opens up I think a world of opportunities for integration activities. You know, as odd as it might seem, a political scientist, me, garbed in a lab coat, working side by side in a dialogue with genetic researchers, would have only been possible with something like STIR. And how can we make that more available for more people? So just to conclude, these are some elements that I think are really important for building that competence, that ability to engage with one's interlocutors on a different level, a deeper level. It requires intellectual humility, a willingness to be very uncomfortable. We can talk, in the next few minutes in the Q&A or whatever about kind of the affective effects that this experience had on me. It was emotionally difficult at times, but a collaborative disposition is essential, openness, capacity for empathy, and yeah, just a willingness to step outside of one's comfort zone and kind of dive into the deep end, even if you happen to be very ignorant like I was. So thanks for your time. I really like to talk more with you guys about the various aspects of this project. And if there's time, kind of where I'm headed.
Thank you very much, Shannon, for that very in-depth description and journey through the 2 lab studies with a number of themes and really rich empirical data to back it up and dig into it. I want to open up the floor now in case folks have questions. I've got 3 questions that have been emailed or put in the chat for me, but I also want to give people an opportunity to make comments or ask questions or raise topics for discussion, since we do have about 20 minutes. And we can also get into some of the more pedagogical work that Shannon has been doing since, if there's time.
And also my masochistic project, in which I'm pursuing essentially a degree in genetics. But
yet another degree. When in doubt, just go get another degree.
Yeah.
Okay. Questions, comments, topics of discussion regarding the lab studies, the use of STIR, the results, the experience of sort of resistance and trust building and acquiring this, these new types of skills and competencies. Marika.
Yeah, many thanks for your presentation. I actually have many questions, but one that came up now during the presentation is to what extent the concept of interactional competence also applies to the people you worked with. And I'm asking that question because I also paid attention to the affective dispositions of my collaborators and actually noticed that they had quite a capacity for handling critical questions very well that I assume not every group has. So to what extent is this not only something applying to the embedded humanist, but also to those we are working with?
Yeah. That's a really great question. So yeah, in both the labs, I would have a collaborator or 2 who we would have like an article exchange. So again, those bench side conversations were really important because things would bubble up. And so the individual Joy in particular, the PhD student in the Canadian lab, decided to start an article exchange with me in which she would actually go looking for papers around the topic of responsible innovation. And she would, she'd leave these articles at my desk if I wasn't there with, a very kind note. And, we'd continue the conversation as she would be, starting her day and kind of setting up her bench. And so yeah, I think there's definitely a capacity for that interactional competence to be on both ends, and that's really one of the goals of my and Emily York and a number of other collaborators, National Science Foundation grant, which brings together educators, at JMU this year, who are experts in different disciplines. So 2 from STEM, 2 from the humanities and social sciences. And we use tools like STIR to look at what are potential interactions between the work that you're doing, and how might you see, so we have a disability justice scholar. How might you see disability justice, making its way into your module on gene editing? So that's one of the, so we're actually trying to, see that in practice, see folks learning from each other from different disciplines. And so myself and Emily are also there as kind of the STS people. So we bring that to the table, and STS perspectives, STS methodologies, as well as our students. We have undergraduate students who are essentially, trained in facilitating a good amount of the interactions, because the students seem to be really good mediators between experts. Because, if you're trying to, talk about something at an undergraduate level, folks are going to understand you better. And it just kind of, I don't know, when people put on their teaching hats, they're less likely to be kind of, catty about, their discipline, and more open to thinking about questions. And, the student brought up this particular question. How might we all have a conversation about it? What do you think from disability justice? What do you think? You're studying global infectious diseases. So I'm kind of rambling on, but that's kind of been one of the things consuming my life for the last year, is actually trying to see how individuals can become interactually competent in each other's domains. Then we're seeing how it manifests in the modules that they're teaching. So each faculty member, there's 4 of them, for their own class, they've developed a module based on the workshops, based on the activities that we've done, based on the engagements. And it's been so interesting to see how different elements of the different perspectives of the different experts and disciplines have kind of, they're like little seeds that are in the modules, which has been really exciting. Sorry for my rambling.
Great. Certainly a topic I think I know several folks are interested in terms of conceptualizing the participants. But let's move on now. Puga's got a question.
Yes, thank you very much for your presentation. So in your papers, there's this conceptual contrast between interactional expertise and interactional competence, right?
Yes.
So I was wondering, what do you think is the relation for integration purposes between, or the differences between these 2 different abilities or things that someone can acquire, either interactional expertise or interactional competence? Intuitively, and for the way you present it, it would seem to me that you gain interactional competence because you purposely go to the laboratory with the intention of integrating something on it, while gaining interactional expertise, you go with another kind of purpose, or to speak with the scientist. But I don't know what your thoughts are on it, and if you have ever thought about it, then what your thoughts are. Actually,
you've done a wonderful job kind of summing up these 2 different concepts in a nutshell. So the idea of interactional expertise is very kind of entwined with Harry Collins' work with gravitational wave physicists. If you're familiar with his work, So he has worked with gravitational wave physicists for, I think, 40 years now at this point, and he gained a lot of interactional expertise just by spending time with the physicists. And ultimately, in order to kind of test his linguistic ability to speak like a gravitational wave physicist, or write, I should say, they did this kind of Turing test type of experiment where there was an expert on one end who wrote a series of questions, and there was Harry and another physicist. Harry's a sociologist, another physicist on the other end, and this is being all done on computers that are receiving these questions. And Harry was actually picked by the person serving as the judge as the real physicist, because he had just spent so much time like engaged with these folks, that he had picked up their language and the way they talked about things along the way. And so interactional expertise was a really good way for me to start thinking about STIR and kind of what we soak up as part of the process. We saw a need for a different kind of term, because, like you were saying, with interactional expertise, there's a different purpose. So Harry wasn't necessarily looking to go and have the types of conversations that we have with STIR. So with interactional competence, you don't need to be embedded for 40 years. You need to have enough of the kind of linguistic ability to understand your collaborators, and you need to have an understanding of the work that they do, to the extent that you can have a meaningful conversation with them. Because STIRers are not necessarily looking to become, interactional experts in the field. What we're looking to do is have those deep dive conversations about the work, and be able to articulate the right questions, because we have been steeped in enough in the language and potentially material practices to do so. So interactional competence and interactional expertise, like you were saying, like there's different purposes and differing degrees of, I think, acquisition that you need to obtain. And so I'm part of Harry's group that studies experience and expertise, and I saw this gap. I was like, I'm doing all this STIR work, but I'm no Harry Collins. I didn't spend 40 years with these folks, but I think I gained something. And so that's where the idea for interactional competence came in.
Actually, if I can jump in, Puga, you might have a response, but just to fill that out a little bit more. The materiality aspect is very interesting here, because not only do sociologists who profess to have or to be seeking to gain interactional expertise, not only do they not engage in the material practices to the extent that some STIRers do, but they also don't make contributions to those material practices. And Shannon's research, was one of the first ones to show that it doesn't take 40 years. As a matter of fact, it actually can happen as opposed to not happening, that the material practices change as a result of STIR dialogues, which are very different from sociological interviews. And so it's not just that Shannon gained, competence in the material practices, but that whatever she was doing cause changes in the material practices and in the strategic practices of the laboratory. And we've seen this in Don's study last month and in Staven's 2 months ago. So it's very interesting on the one hand to call this to say, oh, it's not interactional expertise because we haven't spent so much time. Well, why is time so important, right? And so I think, Puga, you're really right to point to the purpose aspect, purposive context. One could even ask about the normative context. But it's sort of humble to say, oh, it's not expertise, it's only competence, when in fact it's making a sort of more impactful contribution. So it's a very interesting set of differences. But I don't know, Puga, did you have a quick responder? And then we can go to Shivam.
Yeah, I was just thinking if the intention also makes an impact on your learning, on the learning of the person that goes into the laboratory. But Shannon responded that yes, and I think she's right given my experience also, or at least intuitively. This is the first time I read the paper about interactional competence. So yeah, thank you.
Great. Shivam.
Hey, Shannon, thanks for the presentation. It was wonderful. You had mentioned a couple particular things that had happened to your participants. And the two that I was most interested was, the first one was when the person started realizing they had autonomy and said that they do make decisions. Did that show up anywhere else? And can you speak a little bit more about that experience in particular?
Yeah, so I would say, well, it even kind of showed up in my conversations with my initial conversations with the PI. She was like, I don't understand why you're interested in studying this, because I was like, I'm interested in decision making. She's like, we don't, you know, she'd say stuff like that, like, we don't make decisions, you know, the placentas come in, we analyze them, we, you know, publish papers, etc. So she couldn't understand why I was like interested in them in particular, you know, in terms of decision making. But with that one PhD student in particular, I'd say he was kind of probably the most salient example of someone who just kind of initially was like, I don't understand what you're talking about. I don't make decisions. I do what the PI tells me to do. And, you know, over the course of time and, you know, kind of building that trust relationship and going through the protocols, he realized he actually does make a lot of decisions on a daily basis. And, you know, he also said, nothing I do is political. And so as the Socratic gadfly, you know, I kind of, you know, just started asking questions, and he was like, huh, yeah, okay. I'm starting to see where you're coming from. But, you know, the lab itself is kind of a highly politically charged place because of the sensitive nature of what they work on. So as I mentioned, the Canadian laboratory does a lot of work on placentas and, you know, various genetic issues related to births, and also not always births. Some of the samples come from abortions, and so it's a very kind of touchy balancing act. And you know, when we were having that conversation, you know, when I was invited to talk about responsible innovation at that lab meeting, that sensitive topic came up as to, you know, like, you know, in also placentas from miscarriages, for example.
Yeah.
You know, this is a very sensitive topic. So how can we, you know, engage with folks who have, you know, done this wonderful thing and donated without triggering them, without, you know.
Yeah, not getting into the
Yeah.
hairy side of it. That makes sense. Did the idea of them making decisions come at the end of your SIR sessions, or like towards the middle, or after just like a couple sessions?
Kind of like the realization.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of them just kind of, you know, after sitting down with me and like doing a little bit of brainstorming, could come up with, you know, some sort of everyday decision, or, you know, something that might be on the horizon. So I think that they were attuned to it a bit. But you know, for some, like the PhD student that I mentioned, it took a longer time. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, and thank you both for this conversation, because this gets to sort of the heart of the sort of the STIR phenomenon, what really needs to be explained conceptually, and that what are the conditions under which these changes occur, because they fly in the face of a lot of sociological theory that says, you know, the barriers to opening up and to interdisciplinary collaboration are simply structural, and their condition, you know, well, why is it that they can shift, and under what conditions do they shift? So this is a sort of plea to all of you to keep thinking together about, you know, rich descriptions of these transitions. I call them T1 to T2. We don't make decisions. I guess we do make decisions, right? The more we can understand conceptually and theoretically, or at least develop rich empirical nuances, such as Shannon was just providing, the more we can sort of begin to really explain these shifts and to try to introduce then these explanations into the broader vocabulary. There are lots of questions I think I have, and I've got a few more in the chat, and I know that Shannon had a great deal to say about her pedagogical experiences, but we only have 4 minutes left, and we did promise to give the floor to Puga so that he can tell us about a very interesting and relevant panel that he has put together for the next 4S conference, which will be at the end of this year in Mexico. So I want to give him the rest of the time to talk about that and maybe answer any questions that people might have.
Thanks, Eric. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for this 5 minutes. So Carlos Garcia and myself, Carlos is also part of the seminar. You might have seen him or heard of him in the past sessions. And actually, I apologize for not being here today. Got an open panel accepted this year in the Conference for the Society for the Social Studies of Science, commonly known as the 4S. Yes, as Eric just said, the conference is taking place in Mexico this year, December 7th to December 10th. And we would like to invite you all to submit a paper to our panel. So the name of our panel is Inclusivity and Marginalization Within Innovation Processes. I am going to leave the link in the chat for anyone that wants to check it out. And basically what we want to encourage is discussion on experiences with integration methods. It could be any method, but since STIRS will be given a preference, which have been useful to render an innovation process more inclusive. And that is at any stage of innovation also. I mean, STIR is for midstream modulation, but it could be at any stage of the innovation process. We will give advantages to any particular, to emphasis to those experiences that have bring inclusivity to groups of persons that have been usually marginalized from science and technology innovation processes. In the case of Latin America, for example, indigenous groups, but Shannon was just talking about people also that, for example, are taking end-of-life decisions. So that would be also very relevant. But we welcome like any kind of inclusivity, that is values, practices, anything new that has not been taken part in innovation processes and that you have found out in your studies or in your practices that can be taken into account, or that has actually been taken into account in those innovation processes. So this is why we think that the experiences with STEER would be very relevant to our panel, and we are therefore inviting you to submit. The deadline for submission is April 14. I also just left a link with the key dates on the Forest conferences. And of course, if you have any questions about our panel, you can always email me or Carlos. And so we hope to see you in December, and thanks again for the time.
Thank you, Puga. Any quick questions for Puga? If not, I want to really thank Shannon for her excellent presentation. And I think we all have a lot more to talk about. And so I encourage everyone to keep in touch. And if not sooner, then we'll see you all next month. Stay safe and all the best. Have a good weekend. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Just to reply very quickly to Marike.
Yeah.
Marike, I do not know if there's online